On the night of May 16, 1990, a gunshot at the mansion on Mulholland Drive initiated one of Hollywood's darkest family tragedies. When Marlon Brando's son Christian killed his sister Cheyenne's boyfriend Dag Drollet, it wasn't just a murder that was committed. The collapse of a family spanning generations was also exposed. What happened that night forever etched into Hollywood's conscience the question of what kind of father the legendary actor was. Were the tears Brando shed in the courtroom real? Or were they the final great performance of his career? Tonight, I'll tell you the story of a genius's greatest failure. But before beginning the story, if you're curious about Hollywood's dark side, celebrities' hidden tragedies, and cinema history's most shocking events, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the story I'm about to tell today will forever change the Marlon Brando you thought you knew. To understand that night, we must rewind time a bit. In May 1990, Marlon Brando was 66 years old and was no longer the man he once was. Vito Corleone in The Godfather, Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, these roles were long behind him. Brando's body had bloated, his spirit was weary, and his relationship with his children was shattered. But that night, all these past mistakes would explode at once. Christian Brando was 32 years old, an alcoholic, angry man lost in his father's shadow. The bitter custody battles between his mother Anna Kashfi and father Marlon had torn him apart in childhood. As a small child, while his mother and father screamed at each other in courtrooms, Christian would sit silently in the corner, hoping this would end someday. But it never ended. It never did. Christian's childhood was a nightmare. His mother Anna Kashfi was a British Indian actress who married Marlon in 1957. The marriage was troubled from the start. Brando was constantly with other women, while Anna was becoming increasingly unstable. When Christian was 1 year old, his parents divorced, and Christian's life literally turned into hell. Anna and Marlon fought for Christian's custody for 10 years. In courtrooms, in newspapers, in private investigators' reports, Christian's childhood was a public battlefield. Anna tried every way to keep her son away from Marlon. Once she kidnapped Christian and took him to Mexico. Marlon sent private detectives to get his son back. Anna retaliated by accusing Marlon of being a bad father, while Marlon accused Anna of being mentally ill. And in the middle, amid all this chaos, was a small child. When Christian went to school, other children would say, "Your father is the godfather," but there was no godfather at home. At home were two adults who constantly fought, hated each other, and used their children as weapons. When Christian was 7, his mother was hospitalized in a mental institution. Doctors diagnosed her with schizophrenia. Christian lived with his father for a while, but Marlon was constantly traveling, constantly making new films, constantly with other women. Christian was alone. He was raised by servants. His father would come home maybe once a month, play for a few hours, and then Marlon would disappear again. As Christian grew up, so did his anger. At 13, he drank alcohol for the first time. At 15, he got into his first fight. At 17, he was arrested for drunk driving. Marlon intervened every time, hired lawyers, saved his son, but he never sat down and talked with Christian. He never said, "What's happening? How can I help?" He just solved problems with money and power. Christian's sister Cheyenne was a different tragedy altogether. She had grown up in Tahiti, was the daughter of Marlon's third wife Tarita Teripaya, and had rarely seen her father in her life. Marlon had gone to Tahiti in the 1960s to film Mutiny on the Bounty and fell in love with the island beauty Tarita. He married Tarita, but this marriage didn't last long either. Brando bought an island in Tahiti, Tetiaroa, and said he would settle there, but this also seemed like a lie, because Marlon rarely stayed in Tahiti. Cheyenne and her brother Tehotu grew up on the island with their mother, seeing their father perhaps a few weeks a year. Cheyenne was very beautiful as a child and wanted to be a model. At 19, she actually started modeling in Paris, but in 1989 she suffered a terrible car accident. Her face was shattered, her jaw broken, her teeth knocked out. Plastic surgeons operated on her, but Cheyenne was no longer the same. When she looked in the mirror, she couldn't recognize herself. She fell into depression. Doctors gave her antidepressants, but they didn't work. Cheyenne became increasingly withdrawn, more paranoid, and began losing touch with reality. In the spring of 1990, Cheyenne was pregnant and living with her boyfriend Dag Drollet in Los Angeles, at her father's house. Dag was 26 years old, a calm and gentle young man from a wealthy Tahitian family. His father Jacques Drollet was a well-known lawyer. Dag truly loved Cheyenne. He wanted to marry her. He was very happy about the pregnancy. But Cheyenne's family didn't like Dag much. Marlon thought he wasn't good enough. Christian didn't like Dag at all, because since Dag entered Cheyenne's life, his relationship with Christian had weakened. Christian and Cheyenne had been very close throughout their childhood. Both had grown up fatherless, both had been left motherless, both carried the weight of the Brando surname, but now Dag had come between them, and Christian couldn't bear it. May 16, 1990, around 9 in the evening, the mansion's interior was dimly lit. Christian had started drinking that afternoon and was quite drunk by evening. He had spoken with Cheyenne, and his sister had told him something, that Dag was violent toward her. This claim was never fully verified. Some said Cheyenne made these up to provoke Christian. Others thought there really was a violent incident, but it was exaggerated. Cheyenne's psychological condition was so bad that she couldn't distinguish reality from imagination. Maybe Dag had really shouted at her. Maybe they had just argued, or maybe it had grown in Cheyenne's mind. But when Christian heard these words, all the anger from his violent past boiled up, years of suppressed rage, his mother's screams in the mental hospital, his father's absence, his own failures, everything exploded at once. He took his father's gun. There was a .45 pistol in Brando's house, and Christian knew this very well. He took the gun, loaded bullets, and walked to the room where Dag was. Dag Drollet was watching television in the living room at that moment. He was relaxed, leaning on the couch with the remote in his hand, feet stretched out. Maybe he was watching a movie, maybe the news. No one knows exactly. When Christian entered, Dag didn't even turn his head. Maybe he knew how drunk Christian was and didn't want to get into an argument. Maybe he didn't even notice Christian had a gun. But Christian hadn't come to argue. He stepped into the room, raised the gun and said, "Don't touch my sister again." Dag turned in confusion. Maybe he tried to stand up, or maybe he just raised his hands. Some reports said Dag asked, "What are you doing, Christian?" Others claimed he died without saying anything. Then the gun fired. A single shot. It hit Dag in the face. The young man died instantly, falling backward on the couch, and the television continued playing. Cheyenne started screaming. Panic reigned in the house. Marlon Brando was upstairs and ran down when he heard the gunshot. What did he think as he came down the stairs? Did he think again? Because violence wasn't a foreign concept in the Brando family. Marlon's own father had used violence too. As a child, Marlon had seen his father beat his mother Dodie, and now in his own house, his own son had committed murder. Was history repeating itself? When he found his son with a gun, facing his sister's boyfriend's body, what did he feel? Shock? Fear? Or did he think, "Here we go again"? Brando immediately took action. Before calling the police, he called his lawyers. This detail would later cause trouble in court, because when murder happens in a father's house, he should call the police first, not lawyers, right? But Brando knew Hollywood's rules very well. Protect yourself first, then trust justice. One of the lawyers, William Kunstler, was in New York at the time. When Brando called him, it was past midnight. "My son killed someone. You need to come here immediately," Brando said. Kunstler flew to Los Angeles on the first flight the next morning. Another lawyer, Robert Shapiro, was already in Los Angeles and immediately went to Mulholland Drive. Shapiro met with police, Christian, and Brando at the mansion. Christian was still in shock. He kept saying it was an accident, but police detectives knew very well this wasn't an accident. Christian was drunk, carrying a gun, and had intentionally killed Dag. When the Los Angeles Police Department arrived at Mulholland Drive, they found complete chaos. Christian was drunk and in shock. Cheyenne was screaming and crying in mixed French and English. Marlon Brando was calmly trying to talk with detectives, but the details were very clear. Dag Drollet was dead. Christian had a gun in his hand, and witnesses had seen everything. They arrested Christian and took him to the Santa Monica police station that night. What did Brando think as he watched his son being taken away? Maybe he thought, "I deserve this," because in an interview he would give years later, he would say exactly that. The next morning, news spread worldwide. Headlines like "Marlon Brando's son commits murder" covered newspapers, television channels, broadcast live. Paparazzi besieged the Mulholland Drive mansion. When Dag Drollet's family received the news in Tahiti, they were devastated. Jacques Drollet flew to Los Angeles to see his son's body. When he went to the morgue, he couldn't recognize his son. Dag's face was completely destroyed. The bullet had entered through his nose and exited the back of his head. Jacques cried over his son's body and said, "The Brando family will pay for this." But the Brando family's payment would take years, and maybe they never fully paid. When the trial began, the whole world was watching. Christian Brando was being tried for first-degree murder, and if found guilty, he faced life imprisonment. The defense team was clear. This wasn't intentional murder. It was accidental manslaughter. Christian was trying to protect his sister. The gun had fired accidentally. Robert Shapiro skillfully defended this strategy in court. "Christian Brando is not a killer. He's a tragic victim," he said. "He was neglected throughout his childhood, mistreated, and finally lost control when he heard his sister was being abused. This isn't a crime of passion, it's a protective reflex. But prosecutors thought differently. Christian Brando had drunkenly entered the house with a gun, fired at Dag's face, and then tried to make it look like an accident. This is cold-blooded murder, the prosecutor said. Christian Brando loaded the gun, entered the room, and pulled the trigger. This has nothing to do with accident. New details emerged in the courtroom every day. The Brando family's dirty laundry was aired one by one. Anna Kashfi came to court and tried to defend her son. Christian is innocent, she said. He was just trying to protect his sister. But in cross-examination, Anna's own mental health was questioned. The prosecutor asked her, "Didn't you stay in a mental hospital?" Anna started crying. Marlon Brando sat in the courtroom, watching his ex-wife's breakdown. He did nothing. He just watched. When Marlon Brando came to court, no one could recognize him. Brando, who was once handsome, strong, and charismatic, was now a 160-kilogram man with thinning hair and tired eyes. He walked with a cane. When he took the witness stand, his voice trembled. "I was a terrible father," he told the courtroom. "I didn't give enough time to my children. I abandoned them. What happened to Christian is my fault." He shed tears. His hands trembled. Everyone in the courtroom listened silently. Some cried. Some looked with suspicion. The media carried this moment to their pages. Newspapers came out with headlines like, "Brando collapses in court." Television channels repeatedly broadcast Brando's testimony. But everyone was asking the same question. Was this real? Was he really remorseful, or was he performing to save his son? Because Marlon Brando's entire life was a performance. He was known as the pioneer of method acting. He would prepare for roles for months, entering the character's soul. When he became Vito Corleone, he never left the set. He would stuff cotton in his mouth, change his voice, change his walk. On the Apocalypse Now set, he would improvise for days, reject Coppola's screenplay, write his own dialogue. "I need to know what the character feels," he would say. "The script doesn't tell me that. I have to find it myself." So was he playing the role of grieving father in the courtroom? Some analysts said this was the greatest performance Hollywood had ever seen. Brando could have won an Oscar for this performance, said a film critic. Others thought Brando had truly collapsed, that years of suppressed guilt had exploded. The truth was probably somewhere in between. During the trial, Cheyenne's testimony was very important, because she was the one who said Dag was violent toward her, and this formed the basis of Christian's defense. But Cheyenne didn't come to court to testify. She had returned to Tahiti, and it was said her psychological condition was too poor to testify. Doctors wrote reports. Cheyenne suffered from schizophrenia, had lost touch with reality, and could not testify in court. Prosecutors thought this was a game. They claimed the Brando family was hiding evidence by removing Cheyenne. "Cheyenne Brando is the only witness," the prosecutor said, "and now magically she's in Tahiti, too sick to testify. Isn't this very convenient?" But there was no proof. Was Cheyenne really sick, or had her family removed her to protect her? This question never found an answer. The truth was that Cheyenne was indeed very sick at that time. When doctors in Tahiti evaluated her, they diagnosed schizophrenia, major depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Cheyenne couldn't understand reality. One day she would say she wanted to see Dag. The next day she would say she was afraid of him. One day she would say she was happy about the pregnancy. The next day she would say she didn't want the baby. Doctors hospitalized her and started medication, but Cheyenne didn't improve. On the contrary, she got worse. Her brother Christian's killing of Dag completely destroyed her. "I caused this," she would say. "I told Christian that Dag hit me. Christian killed him because of this. This is my fault." Psychologists tried to tell her it wasn't her fault, but Cheyenne didn't believe them. Robert Shapiro, the famous lawyer who would later become famous for the O.J. Simpson case, had taken on Christian's defense. Shapiro followed a very clever strategy. He chose to waive jury trial and present defense directly to the judge, because a jury could be emotionally influenced and make decisions with anger. A jury might think Marlon Brando's rich son killed a man and give life imprisonment, but a judge could think more coolly, more legally. Shapiro also skillfully used the media. He told the tragic past of the Brando family, explained how Christian was neglected, explained Cheyenne's psychological problems. "This is not murder, it's a tragedy," Shapiro said. "Christian Brando is not a monster, he's a victim," and the strategy worked. After months of negotiations, Christian Brando confessed his guilt, but not for first-degree murder, but for voluntary manslaughter. Sentence: 10 years in prison. With good behavior he could get out in 6 years. When Christian was convicted on February 26, 1991, there was a strange silence in the courtroom. Dag Drollet's family was crying. They didn't think they had achieved justice. For them this was too light a sentence. If Christian Brando hadn't come from a rich and famous family, he would have gotten life imprisonment, they said. Dag Drollet stood up and shouted at the judge, "This is not justice. My son is dead and his killer only gets 10 years. This is a shame." Court security guards escorted Dag out.
The Brando family quietly left the courtroom. When Christian was taken to prison, Marlon Brando watched his son leave. Was this their last meeting? No. But maybe it should have been, because the story doesn't end here. While Christian was in prison, Cheyenne's condition was getting progressively worse. In Tahiti, living with her mother, her psychological problems had become uncontrollable. She had completed her pregnancy and had a son from Dag. She named the baby Tuki, but motherhood couldn't save Cheyenne. On the contrary, it made her worse. She couldn't take care of her child. She had completely lost touch with reality. Doctors gave her antipsychotic drugs, but none worked. Cheyenne couldn't get the murder her brother committed out of her head. She blamed herself. If I hadn't told that Dag hit me, Christian wouldn't have killed him, she thought. And this thought was eating her from the inside. Cheyenne's mother, Tarita, did everything she could. She took care of her grandson, took her daughter to doctors, talked with her. But Cheyenne couldn't be saved. One day happy, one day depressed, one day paranoid. She wasn't calling Marlon, wasn't talking with him. My father abandoned me, she would say. He never loved me. He left me in Tahiti and forgot me. Marlon tried to call Cheyenne, but Cheyenne wouldn't answer the phone. Marlon thought about going to Tahiti, but Tarita said she didn't want him. You've caused enough damage, Tarita said. Stay away from my daughter. On the morning of April 16, 1995, at her mother's house in Tahiti, Cheyenne hanged herself. She was 25 years old. When Tarita entered her daughter's room in the morning, she found her dead. In her suicide note, she had written, "I can't take it anymore. My brother killed a man because of me. I don't want to live anymore. Tell Tuki his mother loved him, but couldn't take care of him. When Tuki grows up, tell him to stay away from this family. The Brando surname is a curse." When Marlon Brando received the news, he completely collapsed. He was alone in his Los Angeles house, and when the phone rang, he heard Tarita's voice. "Cheyenne is dead," Tarita said. "She died because of you." Marlon couldn't say anything. He hung up the phone and cried. How many years had he not cried? Maybe never. But that day he cried. He couldn't even attend Cheyenne's funeral, because the Tahitian government didn't give him a visa. The official reason was that Brando had disrespected the island's culture. Years ago he had made derogatory comments about the Tahitian people in an interview. But the real reason was probably different.